So, yeah, I'm going to talk about some theoretical work that we did with some colleagues on complex system dynamics. Yes, so whenever I talk to my physicist colleagues about ecology, what I usually say is that you just have to look around you anywhere in nature to see a system so complex in its dynamics that we don't really know much about it, and we don't really know exactly how to tackle this complexity. But typically the way we try to do that is by representing an ecosystem as a network of interaction, as was pointed out a lot yesterday, for instance. And these kinds of network of interactions are immediately extremely complex. There's a lot of different types of interactions and different species that interact with one another. And not only that, we have very little knowledge on the values of the strength and how we should actually measure the strength of those interactions. And the classic approach is usually, on the other hand, to study species interaction in isolation. And different types of interactions yield very different dynamical behavior. So you have the classic predator-prey cycles that are of course very well known, competition leading to competitive exclusion typically, or mutualistic interactions. And when you consider interactions in isolation or in small groups, then the specific motifs of interaction matter. Yes, so what happens when many motifs and interactions are mixed, then, all right, is the topic of this talk, basically. And a metaphor that I like to use is from this book by Henri Altan, where he describes life forms as being in two forms of death, between crystal and smoke. And for us, I will use a bit this metaphor as a thread, where crystal means order and smoke represents disorder. And I'm going to start with the disordered part and with giving some intuition. So here's an example of something that is ordered, and here's something that is completely disordered. And the point is that disorder is not equivalent to uniformity, but rather that you can permutate entities, randomize, and won't change the collective output. And collective output is really what matters. We're not interested in the behavior of specific entities, but more at the collective level. And in that case, at the collective level, things are very robust by construction. And the goal of my talk is to demonstrate that disorder, which on the outside can seem like something very complex, actually drastically reduces the computational complexity, or the complexity of the system that we are looking at. And by that I mean that knowledge of a few aggregate features of the system is enough to make system level prediction or ecosystem level prediction, like diversity, functioning, stability, and so forth. And then I will propose that the combination of simple microscopic structure, so this idea of the crystal in my crystal and smoke metaphor, and disorder, is a powerful way to approach complex ecosystem dynamics. So the mathematical formulation of the problem is the following. You have many species that you think of them as representing a regional pool, and they interact to form an assembled community. And you model that by differential equations of the form that I write here, but the exact form doesn't matter so much. What matters is that there's a lot of parameters that you need to specify. So in particular, all the interaction between species, and there are therefore order of S squared parameters. And the question is that way too many to deal with? Is that something that in any case we will never approach empirically? And to address that question, there are techniques from statistical physics that I've learned from a colleague of mine from Israel, Guy Bunin. And I'm going to describe this very briefly. And the point is that in the maximally disordered setting, where you take your model for many species community, and you pick at random the species growth rates or carrying capacities, and also their interactions, but you fix the statistics of some basic statistics of those random numbers, like the variance and the mean, and some correlation between them. So, for instance, how reciprocal interactions can be. Then the claim is that those fixed statistics are the only one that really matter. So you can resample many times, but at the aggregate level, it would always give you the same community, which means that despite the fact that you have many parameters, potentially arbitrarily many, there's only 4 parameters that really control the behavior. So that's a drastic reduction of complexity here. And to give a slight intuition of why that works that way, and how you prove it, it's called the cavity method. And the idea is that you assume that you have a community and you isolate a given species, a given node in there, and you try to understand what it feels. And because the interaction it feels comes from many other species, there's a bit of a statistical effect here, and then you can deduce not its actual, not something precise about what it feels, but something statistical or probabilistic. And because that species is not special in the community, but you could have picked any, then you get to a self-consistency condition that tells you, that predicts you, for instance, the abundance distribution of the whole community. So you get a single probability distribution that emerges from a high-dimensional deterministic dynamical system. So that's the expression, the mathematical expression of this reduction of complexity. And once you have that, the nice thing is that all the dynamical properties at the system level can be predicted as function of those basic statistics, or those basic generic parameters like mean, interaction strength, variance, and symmetry. And you can explain why in some cases the ecosystem has a stable state, and why it can also fall into regimes where there are many stable states and even chaos. But so here, that was the case where we took the maximally disordered setting where we really draw everything at random. And in a sense, you might feel that it's not surprising that it works, since we are picking things from random distribution that are not parameterized by many numbers anyway. But the question is, do models that we use to represent ecological system, are they themselves disordered? Do they behave in that generic way? And that's something we did in a paper in 2018, and we show that yes, more often than we think, things are much more disordered than they look. So we took many different forms of models that have some underlying structure, some underlying mechanism that make them somewhat specific, but then show that really, if you just measured the mean and variance of interaction, you would actually predict the aggregate level properties of such systems. And here's an example where you have a resource competition model. So there is a non-random structure in there, in the sense that there are species competing for underlying resources. But what the lines show is the predictions if we forgot totally about this structure and just measured some basic statistics of interaction strength. And we see that basically, as soon as there are many resources, the system behaves like something completely generic. So where, despite the fact that there's a lot of parameters and some underlying structure, you can understand it completely by looking at it as something fully disordered. And what's interesting and what makes those high-dimensional systems set apart from the intuition we might get if we were just looking at simple interaction motifs is that you can, since they are all characterized by the same parameters, if those parameters coincide, then the systems become effectively the same. And so you can take example where the interactions are only predator-prey, and the other one where it's just a resource competition, and they have underlying parameters that are different, but if you project it in the space of generic parameters and you find places where those generic parameters coincide, then you can have setting where predator-prey and resource competition become exactly the same thing. So those distinctions that were very neat when we were looking at specific low-dimensional motifs, they are now completely blurred out into disorder. And finally, what we can look at is, what about network structure? What kind of network structure in the interaction, in the interactions break away from disorder? And so here I show a bunch of them, but what is important to notice, without going into the details, is that some network structure do not generate, so the vertical axis here tells you how you depart from the prediction from disorder, so how, another way, how ordered you are. And so some network structure, as I vary them, they don't create any departure from disorder, especially in a case where interactions are purely mutualist. Here there's nothing really changes. And the kinds that do are, for instance, nestedness and like group structure. If I start generating groups in my interaction matrix, then I do have a departure from disorder. But most of the time, when there is no departure from disorder, it doesn't mean that the network structure doesn't do anything. What it does is only to change indirectly those generic parameters. And recently, some colleagues have showed that this disordered approach actually applies to some real-world example, like grassland experiments. So I encourage you to read this paper to see how we can make prediction for real-world examples. All right, so that was the complete disorder case, but in a way you may ask, well, if it's not disordered, does this mean that all this approach falls apart? And here I'm trying to go back to this metaphor of crystal and smoke, which is also something that resonate with a certain dichotomy that is present in other fields of science, which is this idea of having a relationship between things that are structured and randomness. So the quote that I'm showing here is from Terence Tao, who is a mathematician. He's talking here about a certain approach to number theory, and in the setting where I'm talking now, it's more about those complex systems where you want to create a dichotomy between simple structure, macroscopic structure, and disorder. I'm going to show a bit how you can do that. And here's an example of something that has some structure, which would be, for instance, a plant pollinator community where you have you have plants that are being pollinated, and what I'm varying across this axis is the level of order that I generate. So here you should have actually read competitive interactions between the guilds that they don't show here, but they should be. And so you go from something that is a bit where the interactions are completely mixed up to, on the right, a case where you have this nicely ordered bipartite system. And just by adding this two group structure and still taking into and seeing it as two disordered groups that are interacting and only keeping track of some statistics of that interaction, what you see here is that the line, which is the prediction from the disorder plus structure, reproduces very well, for instance, the fraction of survivors that you would have in that community. So just by adding to disorder this simple information about a macroscopic two-group system is enough to recover the system level behavior. So that's a bit the kind of philosophy I want to keep pushing from now on. And this echoes some, for those who have seen this kind of stuff, it echoes some clustering approaches of empirical networks. So here's an example from my colleague Sonia Kefi, where there's some empirical data on interactions in the benthic system, and they looked at, tried to make it into some clusters of clustering the network and trying to see the interaction between them. But there's a slight subtlety, though, that I would like to point out, is that looking at clustering the network is not necessarily going to give you what is the structure that is dynamically relevant. And to illustrate that, I'm just showing you here a simple example where you're going again from this disordered system to a two-group system, and you can ask a clustering method to see if it detects those two groups. So that's the blue line, for instance, or the orange line. And you can look at, in green, how much not taking into account this group matters for the collective outcome. And what you see quite clearly here is that the partitioning method, like SBMs, for instance, they find two groups very soon, but at the same time, there is no impact on the dynamic that there is these two groups. So seeing those two groups in that intermediate level of structure is actually not that useful. It's not very useful information. So the point here, the moral is that if structure is hard to detect, then it probably doesn't do much in the dynamics. But the converse is not true. That a structure is detected does not mean that it matters. And using this this lesson, I'm going to move now into some more applied perspectives that we are pushing at the moment, which is trying to find the order that lies within food webs. And already in food webs, there's a bit of a tension between two perspectives, more like a system level perspective, where there's this organization of trophic systems into trophic levels, and there are fluxes going from the bottom to the top. And at the same time, a view that is more like complex network approaches that don't really reflect this trophic level perspective. And so it's not clear at all if those perspectives are in fact compatible. And so that's the kind of question I'm going to address in the remaining parts of my talk. So the idea here is to ask, are food webs kind of like food chains? So in a sense that if you have a complex food web, you want to see it as a food chain, and by being like a food chain, you mean that it has a similar cascading effects, biomass pyramids, and stability properties. So again, at the aggregate level. And we know that the behavior of chains is determined by just a few synthetic parameters. So that's some recent work by me and some colleagues. But food webs are not chains. The question is, at some aggregate levels, do they behave as such? And in which case, those few synthetic chain parameters would be emergent from the underlying complexity. So that opens up a bunch of questions, and a lot of them are unresolved. But I think they are quite important to understand. And so how do we, here's a proposal of how to address that question, is to, again, combine this idea of order and disorder to understand the complex food web. And the idea is to group species into levels, and those levels, see them as disordered groups, a bit like in the first part of my talk, the same idea where you only need some aggregate statistics of the interactions. And then you make a chain of those disordered groups. That's the idea. And what's nice about that is that it's you can pose it as it's a well-posed optimization problem, because you can just increase the number of groups, and if you think of it as, if you only put one group, then clearly you're missing all the trophic structure, and one group will not behave at all like the food web. But if you increase too much the number of groups, then you're just going to make an extremely long chain that is also not at all representative of the underlying food web. So you have a well-posed optimization problem, and without having to add information criterion, which is a nice thing. And we can look now at, for any food web, look at the optimal chain in that sense. Optimal in a sense that it reproduces well the aggregate level behavior in terms of cascading effects, biomass structure, etc. And what we find here is that trying that on a plethora of complex models that we generate from niche models and whatever, we see here two things. So in orange, we have on the left, we have the cumulative distribution of the error that is being made by looking at the chain structure instead of the real food web. And what we see is that basically 90%, in 90% of the cases, we have less than 10% error. And what's nice is that if we compare that to a grouping that we would base on clustering, classic clustering method, then it would actually do a little bit better. So that's in blue, is the cumulative distribution of the SBM. But it does a little bit better, but that's not really what's most important. What's really important is that in terms of number of groups that it detects, it's drastically different. You see that for the optimal chain, you find at most 8, 9 trophic levels. But the SBM, which doesn't care about the trophic structure, which only trying to cluster the food web into groups, it can actually go up to many groups, like 30 groups. So it's detecting too much structure for our purpose. So in conclusion, what I think I would like you to take out of this talk is that the combination of structure and randomness is a powerful way to approach complex systems. There's this interesting subtlety that a structure is hard to detect, probably doesn't have much of an effect at the system level dynamics, but the converse is not true. It's not because you see a structure that it matters. And for that, prior knowledge or ecological knowledge can guide the inference a lot. For instance, in the food web case, we know we already have this ecological intuition of the food chain, and that is what helps us group things in a relevant way. Whereas if we didn't and did a more systematic approach, like a clustering approach, then we would find many groups that we don't really know what they represent. And of course, understanding how food webs differ from food webs is not done. Like in the example I gave, it seemed to work, but we still don't really understand what controls how the departure from this chain behavior. And some open question, of course, we don't really know how to list exhaustively the deviation from disorder. And I've only here treated this idea of deviating from disorder by creating group structures, but there are many other ways you could think of course. And finally, if it's true that many species models look very disordered, is it the case about ecological reality? It's not that. I gave this example of the grassland that is really disordered, but it's also disordered by the way it's designed, because it's an experiment where you just plant plant species a bit at random. But it would be very important and interesting to know how disordered and how structured really are like true empirical systems. And on that topic, there's going to be a 2-year postdoc that will soon be advertised at Trinity with Andrew Jackson, where it would be focused on looking at this emergence of chain behavior in empirical food webs. All right, thanks. That's it for me.